Slater Crusaders, happy Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. Welcome back to, a week where I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about Iran. We're going to dedicate the show to it today, definitely. I want to follow up on some points I made on Friday. 3 points in particular. First point, most people have no idea what they're talking about with Iran. They could not point to Iran on a map, and they've never heard of Qasem Soleimani. Here's a good meme found on the interwebs the other day. This is why I'm sort of in favor of literacy tests for voting. Don't get me wrong, nothing complicated, nothing, just a question like, tell me one thing about anything. It's like name a congressman, name a country. How many states are there? Just like basics, like really, really low bar. And still, I think we knock off 20% of voters. And with this simple meme, same thing. Just name the country. Just point to the country you're talking about. Okay, you want to talk about Iran? Point to Iran. Okay, if we did that, we'd knock off 90% of people commenting about this whole situation. Jesse Kelly wrote the other day, he said, stop listening to the people who are always wrong about everything. Similarly here, don't listen to people who have no idea what they're talking about. You know, you have AOC calling what Trump did a war crime, politicians calling this an assassination, all of them completely ignoring the hundreds of Americans that this guy's killed already, and the fact that he just ordered an attack on our embassy. All right, so put those folks under the same category as well. Do you remember just a couple weeks ago when the NBA got in trouble for cozying up to communist China, and reporters asked NBA players and coaches their thoughts about the Hong Kong protesters, and do you remember all the players and all the coaches played dumb? They're like, oh, geez, I don't really know. I haven't really thought much about it before. And honestly, I had a tough time criticizing that because even as clear-cut as that situation was, I don't really think anyone should look to NBA players and coaches for political insight. So I didn't really give him a hard time. But Steve Kerr in particular was very hesitant to say anything negative about China. But I'll tell you, when he's got a chance to say some bad things about America, he's sure got something to say. And he went spouting off the other day about us and Iran. Take all of those people with a grain of salt. Do the best you can to ignore them. So first thing, most people have no idea what they're talking about, which is why we have two experts joining us in this hour to give us their actual informed insight. Second thing we said on Friday, you can't trust the media with any of this. You can't trust the media with any of this. This is the New Yorker's first article about Soleimani. Check this out. Soleimani, a flamboyant former construction worker and bodybuilder with snowy white hair, a dapper beard, an arching salt and pepper eyebrow. What is this, 50 Shades of Grey? A dapper beard and arching salt and pepper eyebrow? What is wrong with you? You're laying it on a bit thick here, guys. You don't have to worship him. Just because he's dead, you don't have to write a glowing article just because Trump ordered him dead. Check that. This is Drew Holden from Resurgent and the DC Examiner. He did a side-by-side of headlines about the death of this guy who killed hundreds of Americans, and Don Imus, who passed away a week or so ago as well. So here's this Huffington Post one. Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani assassinated by U.S. in Baghdad airstrike. And you compare that with how the Huffington Post recorded Don Imus. Don Imus, racist radio show host, dead at 79. So again, Soleimani, the poor guy, assassinated by America in an airstrike. Unbelievable. But Don Imus, racist radio show host. Same thing, Washington Post. Airstrike at Baghdad airport kills Iran's most revered military leader. They revere this man. Compare that to Washington Post. Don Imus, talk show host who turned bad behavior into big ratings, dies at 79. They couldn't bring themselves to say one positive thing about Don Imus. Got a lot of Obama-era officials coming out calling this such a terrible move. Ben Rhodes in particular. Ben Rhodes was the Obama National Security Advisor. You remember it was a couple of years ago. He said this to New York Times. He said, all these newspapers used to have foreign bureaus. Now they don't. They call us, the media, they call us to explain to them what's happening in Moscow and Cairo. Most of the outlets are reporting on world events from Washington. The average reporter we talk to is 27 years old, and their only reporting experience consists of being around political campaigns. That's a sea change. Here's the key line. They literally know nothing. Okay, so that's Obama's national security advisor just a couple of years ago saying that the media, most of their 27-year-old kids, they literally know nothing. They literally know nothing. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. I want to get back to one of those experts that we were just talking about. Mike Baker spent 17 years in the CIA. He's now the president of a group called Diligence, which is a global intelligence and security firm. Mr. Baker, how are you, brother?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
I saw this tweet you sent out the other day. You said, I had no idea there were so many Iran, counterterrorism, and geopolitical experts on Twitter. Why is that? Why, when something like this happens, do people just come out of the woodwork?
And they all came out of the woodwork. You know, as soon as the reports came out about Soleimani, suddenly everybody. I mean, it's fine. Everybody's got an opinion, but the problem with social media is that the opinions are always couched as fact, and then the next thing you know, everybody's disappearing down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. What do we need to know? Based on your expertise, your 17 years plus doing all this, what do we need to know that you don't think anyone's talking about or thinking about?
Well, I mean, they're covering this. All the various outlets are covering this from a lot of different angles. But I mean, I think first and foremost, the idea that somehow, Soleimani was a foreign leader. Look, Soleimani was a top terrorist of a state that sponsors terrorism. It's the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. And Soleimani was the architect of their terrorist activities through all their various proxies, through the Quds Force. He was the architect of their intelligence operations. And he was essentially, look, I don't want to make him out to be Lex Luthor, but he was also, essentially the architect of this concept of Iranian influence stretching from, throughout the Gulf of Oman all the way to the Mediterranean shores. So, he's been at this for decades, and it was personally responsible for planning, authorizing, overseeing operations and activities over the past many years that resulted in the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of U.S. soldiers and far more Iraqi and other soldiers, police, and civilians. So, I'm not mourning his passing by any chance. I would say this is just as well served and overdue. Is there the chance for retaliation on the part of Iran? Of course there is. And it's very likely. And we are taking a variety of steps to ensure that, to the degree we can, we're protecting, and our allies are protecting their facilities and personnel, of course, overseas.
Yeah. What do you make of the argument of her that when you do something like this, when you take out a top guy like this, then there's just going to be another devil that comes up and is even worse than the one that we took out? How do you think through that argument?
Yeah, well, sure, of course. Look, terrorists, one of the things they have going for them is what seems to be sometimes a bottomless well of recruits. And you could argue the same thing in the case of the Iranian regime, that 12 hours or so after Soleimani was taken out, they had named his deputy as the next commander of the Quds Force. So, you're always going to get somebody to come in and fill the gap. But, to be honest, Iran is going to have, the regime is going to have a hard time replacing Soleimani, his capabilities. And again, he wasn't the world's, arch villain. I don't want to give him too much credit. He just had a lot of resources behind him and the motivation to engage in all the various murder and mayhem that he's caused over the past 20 years or so.
Do you think the president did this on a whim?
Well, if you read some of the mainstream media outlets, then that would be your impression. The reality is no. Look, Soleimani's been a potential target, stretching back through at least a couple other administrations. So nobody should think that somehow Soleimani just came on the radar of the Trump administration and that the president, got a wild hair one day while walking through the Oval Office and thought, you know what, let's blow up Soleimani. That wasn't the way these things work. So this has been in sort of that game book of potential scenarios for a long time, as has what does that mean about the reaction to this? And what should we be concerned about? What would be the next possible steps that we would need to take? So, I mean, again, the narrative seems to be to some degree from the left that this was just thrown out there. The military came to him. I saw a couple and talked to a couple of folks, in Washington who, were trying to push this idea that the military sat down with him and said, well, here's some options. And then they kind of pushed this one option about, well, we'll take out Soleimani as sort of the last idea, because what they wanted to do was supposedly make the other option seem much more reasonable. And they thought, well, he'll never buy this. Look, the military doesn't work that way, right? They don't just say, well, let's take a crazy idea and throw it in with the others and, we'll deflect them, like some sort of shell game. So, no, this is a serious situation. There's no doubt about it. I don't want to oversimplify how much tension this is creating in the region. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have done it.
Yes, and it's so important. I'm so glad you articulated that, because it's so important. Because for 4 years the left's been making Trump out to be this rogue guy who you don't want anywhere near the nuclear codes, right? Because at any moment he could spout off and launch missiles anywhere. But I don't feel that's what this is. Now, that being said, what do you think Trump's mindset is, or what's his approach to this type of stuff? I don't even want to say foreign policy, because this is maybe even different than that, but how does he approach issues like this, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mindset is, and look, I don't sit around and chat with the president, obviously, and again, as a caveat, I didn't vote for him. I didn't vote for, what's her name? I thought we had 300 plus million people in this country, and man, we could get a couple of different candidates, but I like a variety of the policies that this current administration has in place and has been pushing for. You don't have to like the person. I'm more focused on the operational results of policies that go through the White House in any given administration. But I think the president probably, from everything I understand and everything I've seen and the folks that I know and talk to, he approaches everything literally with that very simple mindset of America first. What is in our best national interest? It's a very simple concept. And every other nation out there, China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, doesn't matter who, they all have the same mindset, right? It just seems like over the years, sometimes we're the nation that apologizes if we seem to be acting in our best interest. But the world exists with every other country out there doing the very same thing. So I think first he approaches every idea, is this in our best interests, right? And then maybe deal with the issue of what does it mean for a community of nations, right? Mm-hmm. So,
okay, so what's the right. I don't want to say the opposite of that, but like, what would you say Obama's, like, because to me, when you say that you're America first, I'm like, well, yeah, like, of course it should be America first, but clearly that's not the only view out there, and that hasn't been the view for at least the last 8 years. So how would you characterize maybe the Obama administration's approach? If not America first, what first?
Well, it's more sensitive to what the community of nations would think, right? So I think the top line there was, what will, not just our allies, but what will be the perception of my administration and our country be? What will people think of us? I don't care what people think of us. I care about our allies. And so when you say, you're thinking about your own interests first, doesn't mean that you're discarding your allies. Doesn't mean that you're discarding the concerns over what it could mean for regional conflict or stability. It just simply means that you're doing what every other country does, and focusing on what's best for your citizens and for your economy and your stability and security. But I think the previous administration, to your point, was more focused, and there were just countless examples of it, but more focused on what the community of nations would think and how they might view the U.S. It was a fairly apologetic administration. We seemed like we were always getting out front saying, "Look, we're sorry about this. We'd like to be better." Well, you know what? I spent a long time overseas in some pretty crappy places, and this may sound like I'm waving the flag or whatever, but the U.S., regardless of what administration, I've always been impressed by the fact over the years that the U.S. does try to do the right thing. We try. Sometimes we make a mistake, but we're good at self-correcting. It could take a while, but compared to everybody else out there, with the exception of a handful of our allies, the UK in particular, we try to do the right thing. And call me idealistic. I don't care, but it's the way it is.
Yeah, I like that. Last question for you, Mike, because we have a ton to talk about here, so we can talk again. But using your 17 years in the CIA, I'm amazed, and I feel like this point has got glossed over, how we found this guy, how we knew he was where he was at that precise moment where we could launch 4 missiles on his face. How do we do that? How does the CIA and other intelligence forces figure out where he is at any moment?
Yeah, a part of that sources and methods, so we can't talk about that and won't talk about that. But it's a great question, and I haven't heard it asked before. So the first point, I suppose, is that it shows you that this was not just some wild hair. This was not just some off-the-cuff concept coming out, from the president one day. He's been on our radar for a long time. Second, it comes down to having excellent intelligence sources. We're very good at operational activity. And whether we're talking about my old shop at the agency, or we're talking about NSA, working with our colleagues overseas and our liaison services, we do operational activity extremely well. Right now, obviously, there's times when the mistakes are made. Fine, it's a human endeavor, right? And you only tend to hear about the mistakes. But what we should realize is that all those people out there doing all this hard work in counterterrorism and the work of national security, we get it right far more often than we get it wrong. You just happen to hear about the times when we're wrong because clearly it's out in the open.
Sure.
Everything that happens off the radar screen, we do very, very well.
Does this mean like guys on the ground? Like I don't even know what that looks like. So like guys, like spies working close to him or around him? What do you think?
Well, it's a combination of everything. It's always, human intelligence, you can't replace it, right? We tried, sometimes there's cycles in the intelligence community where the idea is, let's focus on the technology. And we've gone through that sometimes and we find out that, you can't replace human sources of intelligence. You have to have that. We're very good at identifying and targeting, developing, recruiting sources of intelligence. And our allies are very good at that. And we have a close relationship with a number of them out in the region. So, and their contributions are extremely important.
Do you think there was someone the other day who said,
our ability to understand what's happening in the world through technology, through technical collection is stopping there. I don't want to go any further, but we're very good at it as well. But you have to combine all these things. There's a tremendous number of moving parts. It's a heavy lift. But then you have to do your homework. You have to understand what your priorities are. You have to be assessing and analyzing recent. Look, we said back in December that if the Iranians keep this up, if they continue to ratchet up their aggressive activity, their various attacks on bases in Iraq, using the stooges that they have there, the Iranian-supported Iraqi militias that are based there, if they continue to do this, we said this in December, our response is going to be decisive, and they continue to do it, right? So this was prompted by a variety of actions that are going all the way back through, for years, obviously, with Soleimani, because he's been killing people for years, but a variety of things, the seizure of oil tankers, the downing of the drone, the various rocket attacks, killing of U.S. contractor, all these things added up to this point. We said, you know what, that's it. We have to take response here. We have to do something to show that there's an ability to have a deterrence factor here.
Yeah, I think it says a lot about our weakened foreign policy and positions, as you spoke of, that he thought he could go to the Baghdad airport with impunity and not get blown up from the sky. So they know that we could do that now.
He's a top terrorist for the state sponsor of terrorism. He's walking onto the battlefield. This is not some as some of the folks in Congress have tried to make the case, saying, an assassination of a foreign leader. Nah, that's. I don't understand that effort at all. I don't understand that spin or that narrative at all.
Mike, I got to run, brother. I hate to cut you off, man. Great stuff. Let's talk again, all right?
Let's do it. Take care, man.
Thanks, Mike. Mike Baker, 17-year CIA president of Diligence. True story. Mike Slater, more coming up. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. I want to go right to another expert here who can give us insight like no other. Claudia Rosette, she's a foreign policy fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, used to be a staff writer and editorialist at the Wall Street Journal as well. Ms. Rosette, how are you today?
Great, thanks. Good to be here.
So you've reported on corrupt regimes and nations for a long time. What do we need to know about Iran and maybe what makes them different and where they are on like the spectrum of chaos?
Yes, actually the axis of chaos maybe is a way to put it.
That's right.
Yeah. Look, we're in a lot of the reporting right now. People are talking as if Iran had been a benign power for 40 years, 41 years now, and suddenly we provoked them by killing Soleimani in Iraq. And this could now bring some terrible reaction. That's not true. Iran has been a malign, enormous problem since its 1979 Islamic Revolution, going back to storming our embassy in Tehran, and remember the hostage crisis, or you've read about the hostage crisis back then. And then through decades of terrorism, blowing up the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut and the embassy in Beirut, backing terrorism around the world. Enormous interference in Iraq since we toppled Saddam Hussein there. And what just happened was the United States, President Trump, ordered a strike that killed basically the top terrorist working in the Iran regime, that's Soleimani, and who has been responsible for enormous mayhem, carnage, brutality, including the deaths of many Americans serving in the military in Iraq over the years. And the way that this is being discussed is as if we have provoked Iran. Actually, Iran was apparently behind the assault on our embassy that came just a few days before President Trump ordered this strike. That's serious, to be storming an embassy. And Soleimani was such a terrorist offender that the United Nations had him on a list forbidding him to travel. He shouldn't have been outside of Iran at all. Okay, what was he doing in the Baghdad airport? I believe that he was orchestrating the next round of terrible mayhem. And so that's a basic picture of where does Iran fit in the news right now. They've been pursuing the nuclear bomb for a long time. And under the deal that President Obama cut with them and the European Union and Russia and China, they were not actually stopped from getting that bomb. So we're presented with a host of problems with Iran. It's a malign Islamist theocracy that works as a highly autocratic state. It's one of the world's most malevolent dictatorships, and pursuing nuclear weapons and the world's top sponsor of terrorism.
Those are problems.
That's Iran.
I'm curious your take on this, because I'm so hesitant to do this now because I feel like I've been burned with Iraq, the Iraq War in particular. And I'm hesitant to draw broad brushes about the people of wherever that place is, whether it's good or evil, right? Whether we'll be treated as liberators or they're all, horrible, horrible people.
Right.
How do you characterize the relationship between the regime, the government of Iran, the Ayatollah, and the people as best you can, right?
Sure. Well, it's always difficult in the sense that under a regime, we have the same problem in reading the people of, say, China or Russia, or certainly North Korea. What do they really think? What can they even allow themselves to think they really think? Because they're punished if they fully express themselves the way we take for granted. But there have certainly been many, many signs over many years in Iran that there's tremendous sympathy among the people, among many of the people, for the United States, that they want our freedoms, that they would like to be part of the modern world. Now we're seeing this huge demonstration footage is coming out of mourners for Soleimani. You can turn out that kind of a demonstration in a country like Iran, both by order, because the government has enormous power to compel and horrible prisons you don't ever want to end up in, and no system of justice. And then there is also always going to be a contingent that does sort of favor the regime for whatever reasons. They have a piece of it. That's the way it is. But as far as what the people really think, It's the same way in China, going back 30 years in China. Before Tiananmen, the Tiananmen uprising for freedom there, you would go to Beijing and all people would talk about were irrigation projects and how much they loved the party. Well, most people, not everyone. But it was very dangerous for them to say anything else. Suddenly, there was this sort of ignition. They had a chance to speak freely, briefly. And what they were all saying was they were quoting Abraham Lincoln. They wanted democracy. They wanted freedom. Please, world, help us. So that can be what happens. And when you talk to North Korean defectors, you will see there's sort of a double think that goes on. They know something terrible is being done to them. At the same time, they feel it's very dangerous to go against the regime. They haven't known something else. So then there's one more piece of this, and that is for the United States and our foreign policy. There comes a point where the question really isn't, do the people there sympathize with us, but what are our own national interests and what do we need to do to keep this country and our allies safe? That's really where we are with Iran right now.
I hear you say all that, and I'm grateful for that. And I get like fired up. I'm like, I start going down this path of, oh, we're gonna bring democracy to the Middle East. And then I'm like, we did that just right next door, and it didn't go well. So how should I proceed knowing what happened in Iraq and where we are now, whatever, 16, 17 years later, and Afghanistan 18 years later, with, like, can we bring democracy to Iran? Can we go back to pre-79 Iran, where I remember recently I saw a commercial for like Iranian Airlines, and there were female flight attendants and women going to school not too long ago. Like, could we go back to that? What's our role in doing that?
Creating a democracy where there hasn't been one for a long time is very difficult, okay? It's democracies, really functional democracies. You can hold an election. It's easy to get people to vote. In fact, again, when I worked in Russia just after the Soviet collapse, they had lots of elections. They've been doing it for years. They all knew how to vote. It's just that the vote hadn't meant anything, okay? Yeah. What you need to create is a sort of trust and understanding in society of what it actually means and how it works, as well as the whole framework of a set of rules that allow you to have elections that actually mean something. One of the things that they've been protesting about in Hong Kong right now, they have elections, but they don't have elections for any important position that actually translate into power of the people to decide who wins, who gets to hold office. So it's very hard to actually create democracies. That's been one of the lessons of many, many years. However, you have to start somewhere. And the place I think it needs to begin with in Iran is that regime has to go. And now, preferably not by way of some enormous war, preferably by way of collapse, by undermining them. The model would be Ronald Reagan with the Soviet Union. But remember where it finally collapsed shortly after he left office, after he'd spent years challenging them to an arms race where on spending, they simply couldn't, and technology, they simply couldn't win. Talking to the world about the evil empire. At the time, we now remember it as, he was great, he was right, or people like him across the aisle. At the time, he was ridiculed as the buffoon cowboy who was going to bring us into the next world war. But standing up to the Soviet Union was very much the right thing to do. And that's where bringing democracy to the Middle East, huge, tall order, but it has to start with drawing lines that the dictators there dare not cross, and pushing in a direction that will bring down those dictators. That
is so fair and sensible. I love that. Last question for you, Claudia. You've been wonderful. What, in your experience, do all these corrupt, there's a big picture, what do all these corrupt, I don't even want to say corrupt nations, corrupt regimes, what do they all have in common? And how would you say maybe that differs from our experience here in America with our systems and culture?
Sure. Well, one thing that really matters that they have in common, they're sort of the big four today, four major threats, and then a host of sidekicks. But the big ones are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, where we're talking there about China, Russia, major nuclear powers with large militaries and doing threatening things. North Korea, sort of de facto, they've got a nuclear arsenal, Iran, et cetera. And one of the things they all had in common is that they export their systems, in effect. They export their system of values. They create mayhem and trouble around the world. And what they're exporting is not a pleasant system to live under. They are at this point, China is looking for turf and wants to get us out of the Western Pacific. It wants hegemony in Asia. Iran wants hegemony in the Middle East. Russia has been chewing away at Ukraine. North Korea wants South Korea. And they export this in very ways that are tremendously damaging to a civilized world order. Now, in one sense, we're like them, but bear with me for a minute. We too export our values. When we go abroad, we're exporting a rather different system where we've been offering capitalism and democratic ideas for a long time. It's one of the reasons that protesters in Hong Kong are appealing desperately to the United States. In America, we all argue with each other, the U.S., are we good, are we bad? Well, when you're sitting in a dictatorship abroad, America can look very good. Everyone exports what they are, basically. And these dictatorships export grossly corrupt systems that fundamentally serve these corrupt, malign, and often violent regimes. And we're kind of here as the United States remains the bulwark of the free world. That's not a fashionable thing to say, but if you go talk to people in really beleaguered places, it's still true.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm in so much agreement with you, and yet I still fall in this moral relativism trap that's just the cultural soup that we're living in.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we're exporting, we're exporting our system too. That means, we're no better than them. It's like, no. There are objective truths and objective realities and objective differences between those
exports. If you look
exports.
at migration, one basic test is, where do people want to go? Okay. And they almost never go from a more free place to a less free place. The places that they want to come to. And if you look at sort of where is the desirable destination, you are not seeing people storming the borders to get into China or Russia, or certainly not North Korea or Iran. Iran ended up with refugees from Afghanistan because they've had even worse things happening in that region. But basically, that's the test. Where is it that people still look to, want to come to? It's the United States. That's your test.
That's it. That's the ultimate test. That's all you need. You're so right. Claudia, I regret only that the first time we talked was not about Hong Kong, because I know you've been writing so much about Hong Kong. So maybe, I was going to say when this Iran stuff dies down a little bit. It probably won't, but maybe soon we can talk again about Hong Kong.
I would love to. Thank you.
Wonderful. Claudia Rosette from the Independent Women's Forum, Foreign Policy Fellow, used to be at the Wall Street Journal. Claudia, thank you so much. We'll talk again. We'll wrap all this up. Coming up next, True Story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. Super grateful for our last two guests. I like talking to smart people, especially in the sea of nonsense that's everywhere else out there. Another thing I said on Friday that I want to go a little deeper to in here is a friendly reminder for me and all of us is to find nuance in this whole Iran situation. Believe in nuance. You can be against Trump and for killing this guy, Soleimani. You could be anti-war and for killing this guy. You can be against how the war in Afghanistan lasted 18 years and be for killing this guy. I'll flip it around too. I'll give people against this decision some credit. You can think Soleimani was a bad guy and still think that this was an unwise move from the president. I'll give the left, some critics of this, some credit. I see people saying that they don't think this was a good decision. And then some pro-Trump people come back and say, oh, you think Soleimani was a great guy? No, that's not fair either. I'm not going to criticize nuance in this entire Iran situation from this point forward, because that gets us into this mindless tribal thinking that got us into trouble with Iraq and has kept us in Afghanistan for the last 18 years, and I don't want anything to do with that here. Came across this comment from the lead singer of a band called the Airborne Toxic Event. Now listen, usually not my go-to source for foreign policy insight, but I do think he's right in this case for him. Here, he said, for those who did not live through the invasion of Iraq, here's what is about to happen. There will be a massive propaganda push by Republicans to frame this act of war as a moral necessity and to act like anyone who opposes it is working for the enemy. The propaganda push will include enormous appeals to American militarism disguised as patriotism, flag pins fly over, reverent cries to support our troops, as if the greatest support you can offer the troops is not to keep them from dying for no good reason. The people in harm's way, innocent civilians in Iran mostly, will be framed and or dehumanized as the enemy. This will include everything from racial slurs to endless talking points about their bloodthirst and hatred for freedom of Americans. This is why I asked our last guest about the people of Iran and how we should view them. When the bombs start to drop, all the reporting will be about the small number of U.S. troop casualties. For example, most Americans know roughly 4,000 U.S. troops died in Iraq, but what most Americans don't know is 200,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. That number is not true, but we're running out of time. We'll save that one for another day. The premise is still true, though. And even the U.S. troops, they will be abandoned too, as the people who waged the war, who made such big troops, will cut veterans' military care, forget the dead, and move on. And the media, especially cable news, loves a war. They love the spectacle, the drama. It means big profits. It means eyeballs on screen. It makes stars of their anchors. And what will get lost in all this bickering and drama and tragedy and spectacle is the fact that all this was avoidable. That Trump inherited a reigned in Iran that he set in motion, an escalation to war, because he thought it would benefit him. That's where I lose him, right? The last one is where he totally went off the rails. And we'll get back to that. But up to that point, I think he's mostly right. I think he's right. And I fell for pretty much all that in Iraq. And I've fallen for all that with Afghanistan. I fell for the, if you don't support this war, if you don't support everything about it, then you support the enemy. I fell for the patriotism means you have to support everything our government is saying and doing. I fell for that. I fell for the these are bad people argument, which is weird. I fell for it both ways. I fell for the, and we talked about it with Claudia, these are bad people and they just want democracy. They love America and want democracy, right? Which doesn't make any sense. And I fell for the lie that we'll support our men and women when they come home. Well, we don't. Not nearly enough. And we'll hear talk in Iran that will be greeted as liberators, just like we did in Iraq, that will rebuild democracy. We're going to hear all of that. And I'm not falling for it again. I'm not going to get burned on this again. So I wildly disagree with his last conclusion statement, right? That Trump inherited or reigned in Iran. I mean, that was Mike Baker's very first point was, it's not like Trump just walked through the halls of the White House one day and was like, hey, let's just bomb Soleimani and kill him. No. Iran was far from reigned in, okay? So I disagree with his conclusion of it all, but I'm gonna watch out for all that other stuff this go around. I don't wanna fall for it again. But, as we said, I truly feel this president does not want a large war. I believe that he believes in peace through strength. To go to Claudia's point about what our model should be moving forward, and that is what Reagan did. I'll end with this. There was Hermann Goering. He was one of the top Nazi political officials, head of the Luftwaffe. There was an American psychologist. His name was Gustav Gilbert. And he was given access to the Nazi prisoners during the Nuremberg trials. And he wrote about meeting with Hermann Goering. And he wrote this conversation down. He said, this is Goering. So this is Gustav Gilbert's rewriting of what the Nazi war criminal told him. He said, why, of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That's understood. But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. Again, I don't think Trump is doing this, but other people might be. Let's be careful moving forward with all of this. I support what Trump has done so far with Iran, but not based on emotion. We'll be back tomorrow. True story with Mike Slater. Spread the word.